August 20th, 1945. The heat off Guam pressed against faces that had forgotten how to expect anything but scarcity. Engines thudded like a distant, steady pulse. Nearly 300 Japanese women, nurses, students, radio operators, mounted the gangway of a U.S. transport with the wary stiffness of people who had been taught to expect brutality the moment they left a pen that marked them enemy. They had been taught to expect hatred, punishment, humiliation. Their world had been ordered by slogans and careful silences: Japanese purity, American decay, the inevitability of sacrifice. What happened when these women met American soldiers would, in small gestures and slow perceptions, begin to unwind everything they had been taught to believe. They had been told that surrender meant dishonor. They had been told the enemy would strip them bare of dignity. Instead, the first human contact was a calm, clinical reassurance. A young American medic, a woman, moved through the line with quiet efficiency. She checked eyes, ears, tongues. She used gentle pressure and short professional questions. When she reached Sachiko Yamamoto, she unwrapped something small and handed it to her, a piece of candy. The wrapper crinkled, floral paper bright against Sachiko's dark, gaunt palm. The medic looked at her and said, "You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." That sentence, uttered casually as a part of an examination, landed like a small stone thrown at a glass wall. Sachiko's hands clenched around the candy as if holding something that could not exist. Her journal later carries the tremor of that impossible micro-moment, a relief so unexpected it felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed. Not every kindness was grand. It was the ordinary, mechanical compassion, a check of a pulse, a tape around a waist bone to measure circumference, an offered bar of soap, that began to ask a painful question of their old certainties. The candy was only the first fissure. On board the transport, the mess deck became theater. Trays arrived, heavy and steaming, not the thin broth or impossible ration they had learned to expect from enemy hands, but real portions of white bread, canned peaches that gleamed like small suns in syrup, thick stew with pieces of meat the size of a fist, butter that melted on a slice as though it had always belonged there. Coffee drifted in the air with a bitter, mundane comfort they had been taught to scorn. Kiko Sato, called Kiko in other records, spelling uncertain, was a radio operator whose hands had memorized dials and codes even as her stomach had sharpened into a hard landscape of hunger. She picked up a slice of bread, turned it over, touched it as if to check it for poison, and then bit. The taste set something loose. Tears came first, silent at the corner of her eyes, and then she put the other hand to her mouth as if to keep the new confusion inside. Someone recorded the moment simply. A woman who had been taught that the enemy was rot and ruin tasted bread and began to cry. That single act, one bite, quickened an entire room's transformation. Scenes repeated, trays scraped clean, a woman watching another woman hesitate and then hungrily eat, a sailor dumping what he considered excess rice overboard because the ship's galley had prepared more than they needed. The captain's hand flicked at a pile of leftover rice, and the ocean accepted it the way oceans accept everything. To the women watching, rice sliding into salt water read like a sacrilege, but it also read like proof. If food could be so casually wasted, if a whole world could operate on systems that churned out more than they required, what else had been misrepresented to them? The cognitive shock was cumulative. One meal was a question. Repeated meals became an accusation. Their bodies, skin over bone, bellies hollowed by the slow arithmetic of famine, could not be argued with.
Medical examinations on arrival cataloged the damage left by years of scarcity. American doctors moved through the wards with clipboards and clip lights, pronouncing diagnoses: severe malnutrition, symptoms of chronic deficiency. Records noted an alarmingly low average weight among the women. An exact figure appears in archival lists and should be checked for production accuracy. Each notation a factual punctuation to the moral weight of deprivation. Beyond the mess hall, the train carried them toward a coastline that looked nothing like the images stamped in the propaganda films. San Francisco rose in the distance with the clean geometry of a city that seemed to have been built from steel and light. Bridges arced like promises across the bay. Ships and cranes worked with a casual power of an economy that did not regularly flirt with hunger. For many among the prisoners, the skyline itself was evidence. Here was an enemy who could create and sustain scale. The journey inland served as a progressive revelation. A train took them across a continent they had been taught to imagine as a wasteland of moral corruption and racial inferiority. Instead, a patchwork of orchards, mechanized fields, three-shift factories, and small towns. Children dashed through yards with full bellies, their pockets stuffed with food that would have been hoarded where the prisoners had come from. At one stretch, they passed mills near Gary, Indiana, vast complexes of smoke and movement that suggested an industrial muscle unlike anything in their memories. An U.S. officer later stood before them and read production figures, not as boasting, but as blunt truth-telling. Planes, ships, tons of steel, tons of grain, an industrial calculus that made dreams of eventual Japanese victory nearly unimaginable.
The speaker's paper listed numbers that pierce the imagination. The exact digits in his lecture should be verified against primary records, but the effect was immediate. Wonder, disbelief, and then an icier reaction: anger toward those who had sent them to die under false pretenses. Camp McCoy offered privations reversed. Hot showers were for many the first unassailed warmth they'd felt in months. Soap, wrapped and new, was small as a sacrament. The barracks were orderly and plain. Beds were made, mattresses existed, and there were books laid open in a small library. The shock of clean linens and running water became the softest form of education. Men and women who had imagined that surrender stripped personhood instead found it being returned in small, non-performative doses. A haircut offered without condescension, an interpreter who explained that access to schooling was available, a Red Cross package opened with a child's curiosity by a prisoner named Vico, spelling uncertain, who found inside something that reconciled hunger and memory in one slow motion. Medical staff performed more exact examinations. They measured mid-arm circumference and charted hair loss and brittle nails. The language of medicine, hematocrit values, body mass indices, clinical terms, translated into a brutal arithmetic of neglect and the human cost of propaganda. The experts could say with the dry authority of recorded fact that malnutrition had not been random bad luck on the battlefield. It was systematic, the result of priorities and logistics that had favored elite projects over civilian survival. For many of the women, that phrasing crystallized into a moral finding. If leadership chose priorities that guaranteed hunger, then leadership chose the deaths that followed. Education began less as classroom preaching and more as exposure. Newspapers were handed out. Women read headlines, clippings, photos. An American officer arranged a talk in which production numbers were not abstract statistics, but a timeline of capacity. Shipments leaving ports, factories running day and night, researchers at universities producing techniques of agriculture that made orchards bloom in places previously thought marginal. The women learned that in many American towns, women had access to higher education and professional lives beyond domestic confines, an unfamiliar outline of society that contradicted what they had been told about the West's moral state. Reading such accounts, one student, Hana Ishiyawa, spoke aloud in a voice that cut across the barracks. Everything was a lie. It was an utterance that moved from private confession to communal verdict in a single breath. Small domestic acts compounded the shock. An American cook showed them how to stretch a can of condensed milk into something nourishing. A sailor demonstrated how a field mechanization system could harvest in a day what had once taken a family a whole month. A medic explained the basics of vitamin deficiency and simple dietary measures that would restore strength. These were not grand sermons. They were knowledge, usable and small, that began to translate the visual evidence of abundance into plausible explanations for why an enemy could sustain its population while theirs had not. Yet the intellectual reckoning found its moral high watermark with images that could not be assimilated as instruction or utility, photographs and films of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were not displayed as spectacle, but as evidence, abrupt, unflinching photographs of ground and ruin and survivors. When those images appeared, the reaction did not homogenize into a single emotion. It braided grief, horror, and a new, scorching anger. For women who had been told of the nobility of sacrifice, the photographs posed an impossible question. How many of our loved ones, how many whole lives had been expended in the deliberate withholding of truth? Did the leaders know? Could they have prevented these deaths? When the numbers and images were aligned, a verdict formed among many. After a certain point, after 1942, some argued, continued fighting was not merely material sacrifice, but an avoidable transmission of death resulting from choices made in rooms far from rice paddies and hospitals. Anger had a sound. It began low and then took forms. Clenched fists, a throat cleared, a voice rising in a quiet room. Some of the women sobbed until their shoulders shook. Others wrote it down, ink pressed to paper in lines that later became testimonies. The moral question of responsibility was not couched as abstraction, but as a personal betrayal. Long-held loyalty turned inward. If they'd lied about the enemy's weakness, Sachiko's journal later put it in halting sentences, then they had lied about what we owed the country, and that means they lied when the truth might have saved lives. At the center of the crisis was the distance between rhetorical sacrifice and empirical reality. For years, young people had been mobilized under slogans that sanctified suffering. Education systems, local leaders, and an apparatus of censorship shaped perception so tightly that the possibility of abundance on the other side of the ocean seemed not only unlikely, but morally tainted. The U.S. soldiers, through routine kindness, the measured hand of a medic, the distribution of a Red Cross package, the casual availability of bread, undid the moral coding that had made scarcity into virtue. This was not an argument for American moral superiority. The narrative here does not turn into a triumphalist tale. Actions did not come from a single motive, nor were they uniform. They were measured, often pragmatic, sometimes bureaucratic. But for the captured women, the presence of that system, nutritious meals, systematic medical analysis, industrial scale, was not only a tool of survival, it was an unwelcome mirror. It revealed how much their own leaders had chosen to hide, to ration, and to explain away. The consequences were intimate. Parents who had relied on official promises began to ask themselves why those promises had prioritized military projects over children's bread. The consequences were political by nature, questions of allocation and priority, and yet the women experienced them first as private betrayals. Among moments that lodged in memory was the sight of a sailor rolling his eyes at a tray of untouched peaches, scraping the fruit into a waste bucket because the ship's schedule demanded a clean galley. For a woman who had last tasted fruit in childhood, the movement of peach into refuse was an electric proof that scarcity was not an inevitable cosmic balance, but a managed distribution decision. Another night, a nurse named Yuki Tanaka found herself holding a simple bar of soap, its smooth whiteness absurd against her calloused hands. She wrote in her journal later that the soap smelled like a lie undone, a sentence that reads both as a poetic grief and as a moral observation. The Red Cross packages were simultaneously mundane and radical. For some, the sight of a canned pudding, an item that would have been a luxury at home, reopened memories of small festivals, of rice cakes passed in private. For others, the materials inside the package, bandages, cigarettes, a tiny sewing kit, a postcard, were pragmatic. They were not gifts that conformed to wartime narratives. They invited instead the right to choose, to rebuild, to stitch back torn garments and, by extension, torn lives. Not all revelations led directly to confrontation. Many women processed the collapse of belief with a grinding internal work, shame at having obeyed, confusion at what obedience meant now that evidence contradicted doctrine, bereavement for those who had died believing something that no longer held. The psychology of this period is not simple. It is layered with loyalty, fear, and the slow adoption of new knowledge. Education became a form of reconstitution, a woman learning to read an English pamphlet about sanitation, another listening to a lecture about crop rotation, a third watching a short film on manufacturing. These were not the grand reforms of policy, but the tiny restoratives of ordinary life. If the meeting with American soldiers was the pivot, then the photographs of atomic devastation were the moral hammer. Their bluntness created an aftershock. Questions of responsibility could no longer be deferred. Some testimonies emphasized that leadership had maintained a narrative of necessary sacrifice that, in light of the new evidence of American capacity and the photographs of mass destruction, now looked less like noble denial and more like willful endangerment. For many, this realization produced a righteous anger that sat beside sorrow. The denouement of the months that followed was not tidy. The women were repatriated in waves, ships returned them to harbors that were themselves wrecked or quiet. Homes, when they could be found, were altered beyond recognition. Many who had been students found that the institutions they left had been silenced or transformed. Nurses returned to hospitals that lacked now the staff and supplies to house their grief. But the internal movement of understanding persisted. Where once propaganda had sealed a set of moral imperatives, now knowledge opened doorways. On the minus side, an awareness of betrayal and loss. On the plus side, glimpses of different possibilities for women's roles, for civic organization, for agricultural science that might feed generations. The last lines of Sachiko's journal collect the arc of that inner journey into a terse, terrible clarity. They never hid their strength. We hid our weakness. The sentence is both accusation and confession. It identifies a fundamental difference of transparency. The American strength had been visible, legible in its mechanics. Japan's systemic weakness had been deliberately cloaked with rhetoric that compelled obedience in the name of honor. The meeting with American soldiers did not merely rescue the women from immediate danger, it re-educated them, slowly, painfully, about the nature of power, the ethics of leadership, and the concrete consequences of political choices. If one lesson tethers most of the testimonies together, it is this: small human gestures have disproportionate power to dismantle institutional lies. Candy and bread, soap and showers, a doctor's measured assessment, a Red Cross package, these were not symbolic theater, they were the practical instruments by which a set of meanings unraveled. Their force lay not in their novelty, but in their normalcy, ordinary acts of provisioning and care that revealed the contingency of a system that had claimed inevitability. Those who witnessed the transition remember the sound of it as well as the sight. The low hum of generators in a camp that meant lights at night. The clink of metal trays in a mess hall where hunger was answered with portioned abundance. The rustle of pages as women read newspapers and came to terms with foreign systems of production and welfare. And behind these sounds was a quieter voice, one of anger that later turned into civic questioning. Why did they let us go hungry? Became an often asked question that carried with it the seeds of future reconstruction. The American soldiers and medics did not set out to perform moral instruction, at least not in the sense of a directed campaign to re-moralize an enemy population. Instead, their routines and services did what routines and services do. They fulfilled needs. The ethical consequence was not manufactured so much as revealed. The women's own observations are the clearest evidence. The enemy who had been painted as depraved had provided sustenance and care. Their own leadership had withheld. That dissonance produced an aftermath that was as much political as it was personal. When, months later, ships carried many of these women home, they did so not as people returned to past certainties, but as citizens entering a world in which questions had been reopened and truths demanded. Some carried ashes that could never be reconciled. Others carried journals, lists, and a new vocabulary for diagnosis, medical, economic, civic, that they would use in rebuilding lives. Not all memories resolved into neat conclusions. Confusion often sat beside clarity, but the central pivot remained. The meeting with American soldiers had, through acts both small and institutional, forced an existential re-education. History is not tidy. It refuses easy moral summations. But the testimonies we hold, Sachiko's candy in a gaunt hand, Kiko's first bite of bread, and Hana's simple declaration that everything was a lie, persist as moments where the human and the institutional collided. The meeting in those tiny interactions carried consequences that radiated outward, from the mouthful of bread to the lecture about production, from the medical chart to the photograph of a devastated city. The women in those testimonies moved from disbelief through anger to a reflective sorrow that acknowledged both loss and the necessity of a new reckoning. If you want to learn more about these testimonies and see the primary sources that informed this account, check the linked reading list and archival materials in the description. There are letters, camp records, and photographs that help place these small, decisive moments into the larger story of a world remaking itself after war. They did not leave as the same people who had boarded that transport in Guam. What began as a fearful crossing became an education by experience, a slow, often painful recognition that what the enemy had shown was not barbarism, but capacity, and what their own leaders had withheld was not merely resources, but truth. In the quiet of their later journals, many summed their insight in a line that will remain with anyone who listens. They never hid their strength. We hid our weakness.